I met Frank Lloyd Wright as a young college student in my senior year at Baylor University, where I was graduating with a major in theater. The one complete theater that Frank Lloyd Wright did, really, was for my professor, Paul Baker, and it was built in Dallas and is known as the Dallas Theater Center to this day. In 1958, when he came down, it was already in process of construction and would be completed. The opportunity we had was to meet with him twice. Once when it was just kind of getting started, and he came to Waco, Texas, where Baylor University is located and where the theater program was. And he came and sat in what was a very famous configuration for a theater at the time that Professor Baker had dreamed up. And it was a three-sided, that is, major stages were built in a rectangular shape around an audience that sat there in swiveling chairs. I believe he came to see that because Baker had insisted that he wanted that same kind of three different stages organized for the Dallas Theater Center configuration. And indeed, Frank Lloyd Wright adapted it, as you can well imagine, since he had his own ideas about theater. But it did end up being three stages. There was less rectangular shape and more like a center stage that then had two stages angling out at about a 29 or 30 degree angle from the main stage as the two side stages. And so it wasn't as necessary to have people swiveling around in their chairs the way the stage faced the auditorium. All it required was a ramping up and theater chairs set in such a way that you could easily see the three different stages. He was, needless to say, a creative figure that Professor Baker had instructed us about from the beginning of our work as theater students. His introductory course was called The Introduction to Creative Abilities. And one of the things that we looked at was the life and work of Frank Lloyd Wright, because Professor Baker admired what he was doing. And therefore we heard some lectures at that time from Professor Baker and the staff about organic architecture as they understood it in terms of the creative process. I'll never forget that he was quite a figure, much like we see him in many of his photographs. He was wearing his black version of it, as I recall. That is the black pork pie hat, a kind of long black cape over a black, more or less suit, although the pants have been described probably more accurately as pantaloons, since they were gathered around the ankles. He sat in a chair on the central stage and talked to us, answered our questions for about an hour that first meeting. And later, when we went a year later to the Dallas Theater Center and saw the opening, he was there at that time. But was busy doing meetings with other people, particularly some of the donors who had provided the funds to build the Dallas Theater Center. That was only about a year from the time that Frank Lloyd Wright would finish up his life, for he dies in April of 1959. However, let me just sketch a little bit of what I would call the child is father to the man. Where did he get these ideas other than growing up as a member of that family in Spring Green, Wisconsin, that he had returned to early in the 20th century to build his Taliesin home? Obviously, his mother, as he said, was determined that her son would be an architect. So, as he said, I had no choice, really. I grew up believing that that was my calling. And indeed, it is the way his life worked out. Exactly why Anna wanted an architect for a son is not clear in any of the discussions I've come across so far. But she did, and he was willing to be that and saw that as where he was going. The family that he was growing up is a Welsh family of farmers who came over. His grandfather was the first part of the family that came from Wales directly to Wisconsin. And they finally kind of spread out across a valley in the southwest corner of Wisconsin near Spring Green. And that valley later gained the reputation of the God Almighty Lloyd Joneses. They were a force obviously to be reckoned with. And he does recount how, as a young child, 10 or 11 years old, he would go to work with one of his uncles on the farm, no matter where he and his family were living at that time. His father was a minister, a kind of itinerant minister and a musician. One of his earliest memories is sitting behind one of those pump organs, pumping up and down while his father played hymns. His father and his mother lived together for some time, but finally divorced. And Anna raised him from the time he was 12 or 13 to when he finally leaves home when he's 17. He did have 1 year of education at the university at Madison, Wisconsin, where he kind of worked for his tuition with one of the professors in the engineering department because they really didn't have an architect school at that time. And he liked to say if he had stayed around for another 3 months or so, he might have finished his basic degree in civil engineering, but he got impatient and essentially left the university and went to Chicago in search of an architectural firm that would take him on as a draftsman. And sooner or later, about 6 to 9 months in, he worked for one small drafting firm, but then found a job working for one of the major firms in Chicago at that time, the firm of Adler and Sullivan. And it was Sullivan, Louis Sullivan, who would become his architectural mentor. Louis Sullivan was very innovative at the time. He and Adler essentially were the geniuses that figured out how to use a steel structure so that they could build the first skyscrapers. And Frank Lloyd Wright was a draftsman in that firm working on those kind of buildings.